What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. Today we are making an updated tier list for the Pokemon TCG standard format as of April to May 2022. Brilliant Stars is the newest set. We have the European International Championships, the Indiana Regionals, and the New Jersey Regionals coming up all in this format. And I also believe a Bremen special event. I think I got that correct. So we have around four major events happening in this format still, after a few have already been played. So I wanted to make a tier list of my updated thoughts and opinions on what decks are good in this competitive environment. And do keep in mind, this is for a competitive environment. If your pet deck isn't on here, maybe it's good, maybe it doesn't matter if it's good. If you're enjoying it and having fun at locals and tournaments or whatever, this tier list doesn't, it's not made to sway you away from playing the decks you enjoy. This is strictly to express my opinion on what decks have the best chance of performing well at major events and which decks you should be prepared to play against at major events. So before we get into it, shout out to PotownStore.com, best place to get PTCGO codes, PokemonCard.io, where you can share your lists and view others' lists, CardTrooperGames.com, check out them for pre-orders of Astral Radiance booster boxes and a stock of other booster boxes. Use code Celio for 5% off, and Beast Coast Pokemon, you could subscribe to that channel in the description down below. As well as my new affiliation with Dragon Shield sleeves. If you're purchasing Dragon Shield sleeves, uh, use the affiliate links in the description down below. And I will leave a link to the tier list we'll be looking at today in the description below. But first, I want to talk about how I define these tiers. Right, because I feel like tier lists are so arbitrary and subjective, and without a legend, like, you can't really take it all the information in and really understand what the tier list maker is saying. So this is how I define the tiers. Tier S is going to be best deck in format or potentially best deck in format. The meta centralizes around this or these decks, and I expect it to be in top 8 or finals or win the event. Tier 1 has a great matchup spread, usually not taking very unfavored matchups to top decks. People expect it in top 8 of majors. It's not a surprise if it's there. And it has previous success, or if it's a newer deck, is showing strong promise according to credible players and deck builders. Tier 1.5, just the next tier down. This could be called Tier 2. It could be called Tier B. I mean, the tier names don't really matter. The next tier down is going to be just slightly less overall powerful or proven to be good or less consistent than the Tier 1 decks. Tier 2, a step below Tier 1, it may have even less consistency, poor matchup spreads. Maybe the Tier S decks are its two worst matchups, and that's going to be poor for it. But these are all still considered meta decks. And then Tier 3 is where we get into a noticeable lower functionality of the deck. It's probably suffering from multiple issues like poor matchups against the higher up decks, consistency issues, being countered by some of the cards that are in the metagame right now, unrefined list overall, or being meta dependent, depending on, like, if these three good decks are being played today, this tier 3 deck probably doesn't have a chance. That sounds like a tier 3 deck. And if it's not included on the list, it means I think it's worse than tier 3. I'm not familiar with the deck, or the deck is not being played right now. So why don't we get into the tier list with all of that being said. And I will also note that the tiers are not ordered within the tiers. And if they are, it was very roughly, and possibly subconscious of myself that I ordered them. Okay, so let's start at the top. Tier S, I do think that Arceus Inteleon is in the running for best deck in format. This very much reminds me of Buzzrock versus Zoropod, Zoroark, Zorogarb, the Zoro variants, and I was on the side of believing that Zoroark was the better deck in format because it had more skill expression to actually influence your games. I won't spend too much time on the skill floor, skill ceiling conversation because it just frankly doesn't matter to some people, and it's also boring. But Mew VMAX, I think you could, if you play it at an okay rate of optimalization, you're still going to do well with it. And playing the deck perfectly only um it just allows you to reach that ceiling over the Mew VMAX player that's playing at like a 90% efficiency. It's a very hard deck to play perfectly, but you don't have to play it perfectly to win games. And then Arceus, V-Star, and Teleon, there's deck building, there's strategy, there's techs, and then there's in-game strategies and in-game things that you can do with the deck depending on your matchup, especially in the mirror matches against other Arceus decks. I really, really love the depth of Arceus and Teleon, and I think this is a deck that players can actually keep pushing higher and higher by learning lines of play with the deck and learning what cards need to be in the deck, what cards are cuttable, and trying out some new techs. So I actually am weighing the Arceus matchup of my deck moving forward just as much as the Mew VMAX deck right now, which is what made me put it into tier S with Mew VMAX, because I think both of them have a shot at being the best deck in format right now. Obviously, Mew VMAX can end games on turn 1, and it does have that broken attribute about it because of the interaction of Alessa plus Meloetta on turn 1. But once you get past that, I don't feel like Mew VMAX is much stronger of a deck than Arceus, V-Star, and Teleon overall. So that's why I have them both up there. So let me know in the comments down below if you guys think that Arceus and Teleon has the potential to be the best deck over Mew VMAX. But tier S are the two decks that I am preparing to play against the most. I am preparing to play against 3 Mew and 3 Arceus and Teleon at any major event I go to right now. And so my deck choice is highly influenced by its matchups against these decks. If I'm playing Arceus and Teleon myself, I am worried about the Mirror and Mew VMAX. If I'm playing Mew VMAX myself, which I won't be because the Mirror is a crapshoot, I would be worried about the Mirror and the Arceus and Teleon matchup. Moving down the list, we have... Oh, I should also mention, Arceus and Teleon, let's say somebody techs a 1-1 VMAX line. I'm still kind of considering that Arceus and Teleon. It's still straight Arceus, even if somebody techs, you know, a Clara and a Galarian Moltres, a 1-1 Urshifu, a Beedrill, and a single strike Mustard. If it's the core of Arceus and Teleon, I'm considering it Arceus and Teleon, just to keep things simple. Going down to tier 1, we have 3 decks that I've placed in tier 1 today, which are Rapid Strike Malamar and Teleon, the Urshifu Inteleon box piloted by Robin Schultz to a first place finish at Liverpool, and then the Inteleon Arceus Birds variant piloted by Nicholas Moffat and Ian Robb, and then we also saw it piloted in, I want to say, Liverpool. Yeah, we saw a similar version here, and this was Bidoof. So was it Sao Paulo? Yeah, Pedro and Paulo both played the deck to 5th and 6th at Sao Paulo. And if you guys want decks, you can see just about every deck I'm talking about either on Play Limitless or Limitless, TCG.com. So let's start out with Malamar. Malamar was piloted by Joe Bernard and Stefan Ivanov and had other notable placements at Liverpool. And players just seemed to agree that this deck was being underrated and underprepared for. And so some top players took it to breakout performances in Liverpool. I think now the meta is shaping to hurt it a little bit more. Any more collapsed stadium, more Avery, more Raihan and Arceus and Teleon to make Aqua Bullet a more usable attack. More Rapid Strike Urshifu, more Jolteon. All those things are going to hurt Malamar. I think it's intrinsically a good deck, but it's not as good of a meta call now as it was a few weeks ago. And you can hear Stefan Ivanov talk about that more extensively on the recent EUIC meta discussion on Omnipoke's channel. Stefan and Joe talked about that a bit, how Malamar is still a really great deck, but just it's on like the downwards curve in its how good it is as a meta call coming up, but maybe it'll bounce back in a week or two after the next major event. Who knows? I think it's a really great deck, and I'm so happy that we have these single prizers like Malamar, like Meloetta, even that punish people for just playing V and V Max Pokemon with no strategy of single prize attackers or single prize Pokemon to take hits worked into their deck. And you'll see that the decks that are succeeding either are single prize focused, like Malamar, or they have some sort of non-rule box attacker possibility. Mew has Meloetta, Arceus has Inteleon, Urshifu has Galarian Moltres and Inteleon and Hoopa, and so on and so forth. So I think that's something to note here, that the decks I favor really aren't the decks that have no single prize attacking options. Like, you'll see that I have Arceus Gengar, which won Salt Lake City down in tier 2. I actually don't think it's that great of a deck. I think it was just consistent and had some of the correct tools for that event, but we'll get there when we get there. Over to the Urshifu VMAX Moltres deck. This deck is fire, really, really good, but also very hard to pilot. So I don't think we'll see the multitude of performances out of this deck as we will from Arc, Intel, Malamar, and Mew VMAX. I can guarantee we won't see the same amount of success that Mew VMAX will see. It's probably a slightly less capped out deck than Mew VMAX. It's very teched out. It will run into consistency problems sometimes, but it's also the kind of deck with no crutches in it. There aren't, we don't have researches, we don't have Marnies. You have to play each card with purpose, and you have to, basically, yeah, just playing each card with purpose because your resources are so finite. So great deck, very hard to play perfectly. Very hard to play at a moderate level even. Some players are having struggles just picking it up and playing just casual games with the deck because the strategies are probably the most convoluted and abstract out of just about any deck that we'll talk about today. Next is Inteleon Arceus Birds. Notably, I don't refer to this as an Arceus deck because it only plays 2/2 Arceus. It's much more focused on having the Inteleon engine and then being able to react and do whatever you want the following turn. Arceus is a factor of the deck, as well as Galarian Zapdos V, Galarian Moltres V, and Baby Galarian Moltres. As I was talking about, you can see decks like this here, piloted by Pedro. Again, this is going to be a very abstract deck. There are a lot of options. Some of the resources are finite, like one Raihan, like one Marnie, one of each Choice Belt and Cape of Toughness and Air Balloon. So another deck that's hard to play at a perfect level, but I do think this one is easier to play than the Rapid Strike Urshifu deck. So this one's really nice because you have a fighting type attacker for the Arceus matchups, and you have Arceus that's just a generally very efficient attacker, and then you have Galarian Moltres non-V and V as your primary attackers versus Mew VMAX, and the Inteleon wrapping it all up to be consistent and have options throughout the game with shady dealings. So that finishes out the tier 1 decks. Now, I did say that they're not really within order within their tiers, but the two decks that I was considering for tier 1 that are in 1.5 are Suicune Ludi and Jolteon VMAX. So let's start with Suicune Ludi. Of course, Finnegan, my friend and testing partner, got second with Suicune Ludicolo. So I've been around Suicune Ludicolo a lot, and seen it played at a very high efficiency rate, a very high optimal play rate by Finn in testing and then watching, in the tournament and whatnot. So I've seen what this deck can do, and so I might have a different opinion on it, and my whole group probably has a different opinion on it than a lot of the community. So this deck is very, very good. It checks the boxes that I was mentioning. It can one-shot things. It has single prize attackers built in. It can chain attacks. It is weak to bench damage, like, a Rapid Flow or Jolteon VMAX, especially with Jolteon VMAX being lightning type, so it hits Suicune for weakness. But Suicune V is a pretty consistent deck. I'd say it's hard to play, but I don't think it's as hard to play as the Rapid Strike Urshifu deck, or as hard to play as Inteleon Arceus Birds. Definitely even has less sequencing involved than Mew, VMAX, and Malamar, but it still has sequencing that will come up most games that holds a lot of weight and will sometimes decide if you're winning or losing. So very good deck, fairly hard to play. I'm actually pretty happy that a lot of these decks up at the top, I get to mention that they are hard to play perfectly, and that they actually, like, I would stay away from them if you're not studied up on the decks, because we haven't been in this kind of format for quite a while, and I'm thrilled with the Brilliant Stars format. So Suicune Ludicolo, great deck. It just has your beat stick Suicune, and you can pivot into an alternate attacker like Shady Dealings and Teleon for a turn, just to get some chip damage and set up the next knockout to be easier, and then continue swinging with Suicunes again. Really great deck, and has shown its potential in tournaments. Jolteon VMAX and Teleon, the deck can just ability lock, disrupt the hand, and then swing 100 a couple turns and win. People think this is underwhelming, but I'd argue that being able to boss something up to trap it in the active, and then going path to the peak and swing 100, you put your opponent on a timer that other decks don't put you on. Because if another deck does that, okay, you have X amount of turns because they're going to hit that active and then hit it again and knock out. You just send up the next Pokemon. They hit that, and then they hit that again and knock out. With Jolteon VMAX, they're threatening multi-turn knockouts, possibly even just taking the rest of their prize cards all on the same turn. And I think that's a big thing that's overlooked, is the multiple targets that Jolteon targets down at one time is something that's being overlooked in the potential of Jolteon. I have heard people say that Arc Intel just does what Jolteon VMAX does, but better. And I would say, in terms of Marnie Path or Sydney Path or Judge Path, yes, Arceus V-Star is hitting for more damage after doing that, and it can consistently search out the pieces it needs more often, and it's only a 2-prizer instead of a 3-prizer. But I think what's being overlooked is that Jolteon VMAX can take out the engines of the deck. It can take out the Sobble and Drizzles. It can take out the Lotads. It can take out the Bibarels. And if you'll look around the top echelon of the tier list, you'll notice a lot of Inteleons and even a Bibarel thrown in here and there. So Jolteon VMAX, I think, is undervalued for its worth, but I definitely don't think it's as good as Arceus and Teleon, but I also don't think it's a straight one-to-one comparison saying this deck plays Path Marnie, this deck plays Path Marnie, there's only room for one. Jolteon definitely checks different boxes than Arceus and Teleon does. Next is going to be Arceus Beedrill. I tried this landscape layout for the tier list today, by the way, just to better represent all the cards that are in the deck, or the main cards. So let me know if this was confusing at all, but I'll also like wiggle around the deck when I talk about it to show which one, so they don't look connected to each other. So Arceus Beedrill variants. Basically, this is the core of the deck was created by Frank Persick, and then you can just plug in whatever other cards you want into it. So the most notable placement of the deck has been 9th place by Charlie Lockyer with the Sandaconda VMAX, but this can also be played with a 2-1 Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, a 2-1 Lycanroc VMAX, a 2-1 whatever you want in the deck. And so, like, that core was created by Frank for Rapid Strike Urshifu, and also had a Rapid Strike energy or two in it. But this is kind of what I consider Arceus Beedrill, and then you can just plug in whatever cards you want to be along with the Flygon and the Beedrill. But Beedrill is really, really great because it pops out in just one turn with single strike mustard, and the persist sting just auto knocks out something with a special energy. That's going to be great against Arceus, great against Mew VMAX, not so great against single prizers, not so great against Urshifu VMAX since they just discard their energy with rapid flow sometimes if they have a special energy attached. So I think these Arceus Beedrill decks are actually underplayed for how good they are. People might just look at it and have that stigma of it's inconsistent because of the whole mustard Beedrill thing, but it's really not inconsistent. Um, okay, next is Arceus Bibarel variants. This is going to also be a range of things. Like we have this Lycanroc VMAX variant that's been popping up. That's included in here. Whether you're playing the Bibarel with that, or we can even look at Sao Paulo's seventh place list with a 2-1 Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX and Bibarel. These are all going to be the same, in my opinion, the Arceus Bibarel variants, unless noted otherwise. You will see some other decks on here that sometimes play Bibarel, like Arceus Gengar, Arceus Malamar, Arceus Ice Rider. We'll get to those and why I singled them out. But the Arceus Bibarel variants that have not already been tried out and given kind of a place on the list or a place in the meta, I think all have the potential to be tier 1.5 or possibly even higher. But from what I've seen, they're probably around the just under tier 1 space because they don't have that targeted search that the Inteleon decks have, but they do have the potential to fit more lines of Pokemon and more techs in their deck because the Bibarel is taking up less space. And then lastly here in the 1.5 is going to be Arceus Malamar VMAX, which I've seen and heard some great players talk about, that it's just very close to being good, and I would agree it's very close to being good. All it's really missing is Malamar VMAX having a 2 energy attack like Gengar has, and then it would be better. But what it does have is grass weakness instead of fighting weakness, and what holds back the first placed SLC Gengar VMAX list is that the whole deck is weak to fighting, and I don't think you can have that right now with people so cognizant of the formats and the metagame's weaknesses. Fighting should be popping up a good bit in EUIC and Indiana, in my opinion. So I like Arceus V-Star Malamar VMAX better than Arceus Gengar VMAX right now, or at least better than Drew's Arceus Gengar list, which is very, very vanilla and I think needs teching out. Going down to tier 2, we have the Dark Box deck, Galarian Moltres, Hoopa, and Inteleon. Can have Sable IV, can have Galarian Weezing in it. I think this deck gets outshined now by Rapid Strike Inteleon box and Inteleon Arceus box, which are both in tier 1, and then this one is notably dropped down to tier 2. It has less options, but it's also going to be more streamlined and easier to play, which can matter over the course of 9 rounds and then 5 or 6 more rounds of day 2 and then a top 8 cut. So if you told me you were going to play any deck here that you picked 100% perfectly, you're a Pokemon TCG robot, then I would say no reason to consider Moltres, Dark Box, and Inteleon thing, and just pick from the 2 tier 1 archetypes that are very similar to it but have a higher ceiling. But that's not true, and so Dark Box and Inteleon will be an option for some players. Arceus Gengar VMAX, like I already spoke about, it needs to be teched out compared to Drew's list. That deck just loses the fighting type stuff. Dunsparce doesn't save the Gengar VMAX. I think it's kind of like Duraludon VMAX, like Riley Holbert's Arceus Duraludon. It won the full grip tournament, but after that, it got noticeably worse. It was just good for one event. Arceus Gengar suffers a similar fate. Straight Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX Melanie, I think is good because of a lot of the things that I think people will play. You know, Gengar Houndoom and Gengar VMAX with Arceus V-Star both did really well at SLC, and that will make people play it. You know, people look at tournament results and then pick a deck based off of it, buy the deck, practice it for a couple weeks, go to a major, and those kinds of trends will create, you know, Gengar VMAX decks being around, even some Jolteon VMAX decks being around. So those right off the bat make Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX Melanie or straight Urshifu VMAX have some good matchups floating around. And then again, just like Jolteon, it picks off, it preys on the support Pokemon. So we have that with like the Drizzles and the Bibarels and stuff. The main struggle is going to be against Mew VMAX, which you can win, but the strategy of rapid flowing and yoga looping has been a bit ruined by the popularity of Oricorio being included in just about every Mew VMAX list now. But this is still a fine deck. I'd say it's similar to my opinion on Dark Box and Teleon. Like, if you're going to play perfectly, just play the box version of Urshifu that's up in Tier 1. But this is a much more streamlined one and probably going to be more consistent for you as well. It just has a lower potential ceiling, in my opinion, since it doesn't have those tech cards to, allow you to make educated decisions within different matchups and have options available to you. And then lastly here, Gengar VMAX Houndoom. I don't love its consistency. I know players did well with it at SLC, but when they were going into day 2 with high records, I said to someone, like, even if they win the event, I'm still not going to call Gengar VMAX a good deck because I just don't think it is. When you have a deck and its main draw is that it's best against the best deck in format, but then if you actually play good players that are piloting the best deck in format, the matchup feels like you have to work for it, and it might even be close to a 50-50, then that deck stops appealing to me. It's a 3-prizer beat stick, which is great, especially for inexperienced players or players just coming back or newer or even juniors and seniors division, but strictly speaking in Masters division and looking to win the event, I don't like either of the Gengar VMAX variants as they stand right now. Going into tier 2.5, Ice Rider, Calyrex VMAX, these are kind of just like the decks that are solid. So remember, this is not a tier list made up of deciding between every deck in existence. This is just looking at the best decks and then putting them on a tier list. So in the grand scheme of things, everything in tier 2.5 and tier 3 are actually functioning decks that can win games, do well at events. They have won games, they have done well at events, but compared to the other best decks, they're at the lower end of things. So if you added in, like, theme decks and decks that just don't function, then these decks in tier 2.5 and tier 3 would go up much higher. But in terms of being compared to the other best decks, they are lower down. So tier 2.5, I think we get to the kind of decks that are just like solid, but don't really give me an appeal to play them. Ice Rider, Calyrex VMAX, and Teleon, it has that potential for the higher damage output with Leon plus Choice Belt, but it's hard to do that with Melanie. Frostlass is not a consistent engine or option as far as we've seen. Same with Arceus V-Star Ice Rider. I'd actually play straight Ice Rider before Arceus Ice Rider, I think, because it gives you more room to just be a consistent Ice Rider deck and carry out your strategy. Arceus V-Star Duraludon got worse just because of the popular inclusion of Echoing Horn in Mew VMAX decks and even seeing some play in other decks. Then we have Single Strike Urshifu Umbreon VMAX, built similar to the Gengar VMAX Houndoom deck. And it has more options, but it has less consistency. And again, this is a deck that I think is great in like juniors and seniors, and I think it's good for players that are a little more inexperienced or newer or returning to the game, because it is good on paper. It hits Arceus for weakness, it hits Mew for weakness, but it's doing so with big clunky VMAX Pokemon, which thankfully from a game design and game balance and competitive player aspect, these big clunky VMAX decks aren't just running the format anymore. And then we have Arceus V-Star Whimsicott, but this can also just be any Whimsicott decks. I think Whimsicott's underexplored and underrated. It did have a top 8 breakout performance at Sao Paulo, I believe. Over here, and this list has been featured on the channel already. So I think that's underplayed for its potential and how good it is, but I don't think it's better than 2.5. And then going down to 3, we have Leafeon VMAX Inteleon and Rapid Strike Inteleon VMAX. Both decks that have gotten a couple placements here and there, but Leafeon just really sucks against Mew VMAX. And then Inteleon VMAX has a very passive and very slow and steady game pace and game plan that can just be overrun by other decks. And so neither of those decks would even be close to something I'm comfortable taking to a major event. So I hope you guys enjoyed this updated tier list for the standard format of the Pokemon TCG as of April 2022. And these thoughts probably carry over into May for me as well. But I will leave a link to the tier list so you can make your own. I'll put that in the pinned comment or description or something. But thanks for watching today. Check out all my sponsors in the description. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.